what I undertook in my project was trying to explain or justify these kinds of really deeply moving experiences I'd had with text. Reading was my favorite pastime, and I felt powerfully changed by it. But I could not articulate any value for that. And I wanted to try to find a way to understand it as valuable in a form that would carry weight with the academic world. And that's what I set out to do in this book. What I found, as Bruce mentioned, that answered the question for me, or provided a schema that really fit my experience and those that I'd read from others, was, as he said, object relations theory, this branch of psychoanalysis. At the heart of it, and at the heart of D.W. Winnicott's work, is the idea of a transitional object. You may know that it's thought that an infant has no capacity to distinguish between him or herself and the rest of the world. It is all me. And so Winnicott considers that process of separation or individuation to be the primary work of infancy and early childhood. Winnicott proposed that the means by which infants do this in a healthy way is through the use of transitional objects. Initially the mother, but most famously it would be a teddy bear or a security blanket. A transitional object is an object that the infant can recognize as me, but it comes out from outside the self at the same time. So it is me and not me simultaneously. Winnicott says the infant can believe the illusion that I created this, but I would not have been able to create it had it not been presented to me from the outside. It enters this third space. It's related to, and it's slightly different than the third space that Jeff Wilhelm talks about in his work. It's the third space in between, or the middle space in between inner self-experience and external reality. Without the provision of that kind of object, a sudden experience of separation would cause what Winnicott says is unthinkable anxiety to the infant. And this then serves as sort of a bridge that makes the beginning experiences of being separate from the world outside, it makes it bearable. But Winnicott also says that separation, that individuation, is usually completed in early childhood, though not for everyone. And but Winnicott claims we need to be able to return to that same kind of state, that transitional space, that in-between space, throughout adulthood, because the challenge of relating inner self to external world never ends. We are always having to readjust that boundary, that relationship to the ever-changing world around us. So we need to be able to return to these kinds of experiences where my sense of myself and my sense of the object or the activity temporarily blur, and I lose the distinction. I become a part of what I'm doing. Now, these objects that Winnicott talks about aren't necessarily just things. I know I have a yellow mug at home, a coffee mug that my brother gave me for my birthday when I was in high school, and I took it with me, used it through high school, took it with me to college, took it with me to my first job in downtown Chicago. Out of college, if anybody happened to pick up my yellow mug and use it to drink from, it was an offense against my identity. It's still there in my cabinet at home, and I don't use it most of the time because I don't want to break it, but on special days, it's my yellow mug day. You know, it's an object that I so deeply identify with. It feels like it's part of me. But activities can be that too. Winnicott says that any kind of cultural activity, a liturgical service, attending the symphony, gardening, he talks about even scientific work, anytime we become fully absorbed in what we're doing so that we temporarily lose a sense of ourselves, then we've entered into that transitional space. That activity becomes for us a transitional object. And if you think about what the boundary that's blurred there defines, it shows the importance of that kind of experience. That boundary defines my sense of myself and my sense of the world outside me and my ability to relate. So when transitional experience allows that to become fluid, allows us to reform and readjust that relationship across that boundary. Another psychoanalyst whose work I found really valuable is named Christopher Bolus. He doesn't use the term transitional object, but it's what he's talking about, but exclusively in adulthood. And he's got a couple of books really hard to read in some ways, too poetic to be really clear. But really valuable in looking, one is, well, I'm not going to go into the names of them. Ask me if you're interested. But he talks about how in adulthood we seek out and at times randomly find objects and activities that allow us to invest ourselves in the shape of that object and so experience ourselves. This is one of the key effects of the use of a transitional object. We contain experiences or emotions that we're not able to access. Have you ever heard a song that brought tears to your eyes and you didn't know why? I mean, that song in that case gave form to some feeling within you, and without that tangible object in terms of a song, it's difficult to access those places. Okay? That's one thing that transitional objects can do. It can give form to formless parts of ourselves that we can't otherwise access. The other thing that transitional objects can do is, in meeting them, and this is another of Christopher Bolas's ideas, in meeting them, we meet something that has a form different than us, and it leaves an impact on us. So as he talks a lot about reading Moby Dick, and the other example he uses is playing football with his son. Both, you get engrossed in the activity. Each has its own shape, and when we meet that shape in that in-between space, it leaves its impact on us. Okay? And that, he says, as Winnicott says, is essential for healthy human functioning, that we can use these objects outside of ourselves to think ourselves out. He uses the phrase to articulate ourselves or elaborate ourselves, and to be able to readjust and reform and make more temporarily fluid our way of relating to the world. Now think about literature. Now, neither of these authors are talking exclusively about literature. They're talking about any kind of cultural activity, any time that we become fully engrossed in what we're doing. But think about literature. What is literature outside of the mind of a reader? You know, it is just marks on paper without a reader creating imaginatively the world that the words on the page prompt. So Louise Rosenblatt talks about this, the person Jeff mentioned, or Bruce mentioned last night, that literature exists in between the text and the mind of the reader. It's necessarily in that in-between space, that transitional space. It only becomes something when we make it something, even though it also comes from outside us. It makes, in my estimation, literature, literary reading, to be one of the most ideal types of transitional objects, because we can't access it in any other way. What I end up with in my book, and that's the heart of what I have claimed in this book, and what I'm hoping makes a really coherent and compelling argument for the importance of reading literature, not the importance of studying literature, although studying it matters too. But if you think about what this kind of transitional experience involves, it's getting lost in the world of a story. Now think about what we usually expect from students at school. What we consider to be, in the college level, what we consider to be scholarly and academic. In the elementary, especially the high school level, what we consider, all those, my daughter has to, who's a freshman in high school, has to read the text mindful of the quiz questions she's going to get asked. So she reads Spark Notes first, because she struggles to make sense of a text otherwise. So she knows the story, she reads the text, sometimes has me read it to her because it's really hard for her at times to process stuff, then spends, because she's one of those really overly diligent students, then reads Spark Notes again before she goes to bed, looking for, okay, what could those quiz questions be? And sometimes knows the story, but can't remember the detail that shows up on the quiz, and it's frustrating for her. So reading in school becomes this, either a search for the right answer, a way to, looking for the metaphors and the irony, taking the text apart. All of that blocks the immersion in the text that is necessary for transitional experience. For students to learn to use a text in this way, those things, well, the quiz thing may be bad. I was going to say those things are not bad things. Learning about metaphors, identifying metaphors and irony, learning how texts work, picking them apart is a good thing. But if it's primary, if it's the main thing, students miss the experience of just getting lost in the world of the text. And I end up in my book using Paul Ricoeur, a different part of Paul Ricoeur than Bruce uses in his book, but who talks about, I looked at him because he's the first person to use, I think, the phrase hermeneutic of suspicion, which I was working to fight against. Ricoeur proposes the hermeneutic of suspicion and identifies it in psychoanalytic criticism, Marxist criticism, Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche, who all read against the text, assume that the text is hiding its meaning and it needs to be read against in order to undo it. Ricoeur prefers the hermeneutic of, restoration. But as I was beginning my own search, looking at his use of that word, by the time I got to the end of his book on Freud, and I can't remember the name of it, I realized he'd brought them together, and I'm ready to make one the bad and the other the good, but he brings them together in that, and his schema is that we begin in this state of with this naive reading, a holistic kind of taking in the text, but those guesses often fail, and we need the acts of analysis to inform that initial guess. But then the third move is to return to that naive state. It's the second naivete, where we return to immersing ourselves in it once our understanding has been filled out by acts of analysis. So what I'm trying to work on in college literature classrooms is how to both invite students to just enter into the text, see what they can do with it, then build the analysis in our work in class based on where they get stuck, what problems they have, so that they are the source of the questions and the analysis that we then take on to fulfill their understanding, where they have objections, and that's an important role too. Some texts are racist and should be objected to, or sexist and should be objected to, but when that can come from the student's initial encounter with the text, it takes on more meaning than when we prescribe it from our authoritative role. But then I'm also working at finding ways, once we've done this analysis, to help students return to a text again and dive into it in a way that brings it near. So my goal as a teacher and as a theorist is to make space in the literature classroom for getting lost and swept away as the primary experience to realizing literature's value. If we just keep it as acts of analysis, it has no value but as an object of study. And the heart of what literature can accomplish is missed. Jeff is working on a new book called
Let Them Read Trash.
Which I think is ideal. It's valuing the kinds of reading students might like to do, as still we may consider it trash, but if they're able to get lost in it. My daughter had this transformative experience with a movie that she then made me sit and watch. I found it to be so trite and cliche, and as soon as the little girl coughed, I knew she was going to die. And, but for, my daughter was then maybe 10 or 11. It was news to her. It was, I thought it was a cheap, hokey movie, but she hadn't yet learned those cliches, and so for her, it was powerful. So I think we need to lower our expectations and not, expect that we have to get students to read great literature. There's value if they begin wherever they can begin with that kind of experience.
Okay, no, we need to get lost now. Okay, that we can't extend today as we did last night.
Sounds
so
good.
there might be more time for questions.
I am actually going to be selling copies of my book too. So
no, that's when you need to be loud. Bye. And also, Tina, Jeff's book, You Gotta Be the Book, is sort of like the definitive book on how to reach struggling readers. He came to these concepts of evocative, connective, and reflective by comparing the reading processes of his successful readers with those of his struggling readers. And I might also point out that the most successful way that he had was he got through his teacher, Pat and CISO, and that was through doing what you will experience if you attend Lawrence's workshop, which is actually drawing an imaginary story world and using the other senses other than just reading. So thank you let's give Cristy a hand.